Richard. I'm going to go ahead and call this June 18th, 2018 meeting of the Whitefish City Council to order. Thanks everyone for attending. This evening we'll start with our Pledge of Allegiance, and I'll go ahead and ask Sean Frampton to please lead us tonight. Thanks very much, Sean. We're going to now have a proclamation recognizing the Montana Innocence Project Week, and this is certainly rings home on a local level. Before I read this proclamation, I'd certainly like to acknowledge the hard work and commitment two of our locals have committed to this organization, in particular, Councillor Frank Sweeney and our friend Dan Weinberg. Thanks, Frank. Whereas the Montana Innocence Project is a statewide nonprofit organization comprised of attorneys, journalists, students, and volunteers dedicated to exonerating the innocent and preventing wrongful convictions. And whereas the Montana Innocence Project uses DNA and other evidence to advance credible claims of innocence. And whereas the Montana Innocence Project advances proven public policy reforms and provides training and education for students, attorneys, law enforcement, civic groups, and other Montanans across the state. And whereas the Montana Innocence Project has to date secured the exonerations of 6 Montana individuals who have cumulatively spent nearly 100 years in prison for crimes they did not commit. And whereas the Montana Innocence Project now celebrates its 10th anniversary and is dedicated to continuing its work to exonerate the innocent, prevent wrongful convictions, shape public policy, and thereby improve the criminal justice system in Montana. Now, therefore, I, John M. Mulfeld, Mayor of Whitefish, Montana, do hereby recognize the week of June 24th through June 30th, 2018 as Montana Innocence Project Week. Thank you very much for listening. We'll move on to item 4 of our agenda, which is communications from the public. We do have several public hearings advertised tonight. Now is your opportunity to comment on items that are not advertised for a public hearing. Anything you wish to share with the council, please approach the podium. And for the record, your name and address. Rebecca.
Rebecca Norton, 530 Scott Avenue. And 2 things. I was wondering if we could get a dog catcher again. I have a puppy now, and I feel like there's a lot of issues with dogs because we have so many of them, and many people have them off leash, and some of them are aggressive. Mine's not, but I really liked it when we had a dog catcher. I don't think the police are available as much as a dog catcher, and I just think if we could, not maybe this year in the budget, but we should be keeping it mindful that we really should try to keep Whitefish safe. And the second thing is I went to a film at the O'Shaughnessy on Saturday night. Michael Smith is one of my neighbors, and he's been working at Stoltz Lumber on this really amazing pyramid. And I would like one in Whitefish. I'm planting seeds tonight, but I don't see why not. I mean, it's in our backyard, and it's an amazing concept. So just planting seeds to think about in the future. I think we should be innovative in the way that we're going into climate change and what's coming at us, and that's a totally self-enclosed system. So, and the other thing is I'm not going to stay for the budget hearing, but I love Dana's work, and I'm really happy we have her. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Further public comment this evening? I'll go ahead and stay with the audience. Any volunteer board reports from the audience? Oh, sorry, Lindsay, certainly, come on up.
Okay, hi, Lindsay Ramadka, 307 Spokane Avenue, Suite 102, Whitefish. I represent the South Whitefish Neighborhood Association. I am here tonight to talk about the Eagle Lake PUD, and as you probably guessed, short-term rentals. I will be brief, as my letter that I submitted to you earlier today expands on what I am going to briefly say tonight. I want to make 2 points. First, this landowner does not have a vested right in having a residential PUD that allows short-term rentals. The PUD regulations specify that a PUD may be denied upon the council finding that it is not compliant with the growth policy or does not substantially achieve the intent of the PUD, or deviations from standards are neither beneficial to the neighborhood or community at large. So as I've stated, and as your city attorney has stated, and as your planning staff has stated, and Ms. Compton Ring's memo dated June 12th, the city council does have the discretion to condition this PUD on disallowing short-term rentals, and this council should condition this PUD on disallowing short-term rentals. This condition is consistent with city policy, and it is in the best interest of the community. I have provided findings in my letter to you, but obviously I defer to Ms. Jacobs for her expertise in drafting that language. Second, and lastly, my client formally asks you tonight that the zoning administrator request the definition of various types of lodging accommodations within the definition of hospitality to be defined so that the planning board may determine an appropriate definition along with Ms. Jacobs if necessary. Clearly, my clients dispute the planning staff's determinations of the definition of various types of lodging accommodations. Respectfully, the memo that was submitted to council regarding the definition of various types of lodging accommodations was wholly inadequate, and it did not address most of my clients' concerns that we brought up in the June 4th City Council meeting. Thankfully, the Whitefish City Code sets forth a process to define an undefined term if there is any question, which there clearly is. My clients request this definition be clearly defined pursuant to the procedures provided for in the code because this definition has significant implications, not only for this project, but for potential residential PUDs in the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Lindsay. Further public comment this evening. Eric.
Good evening. My name's Eric Mulcahy, 2 Village Loop. I'm here to speak about the Eagle Lake PUD as well. I just want to add a little background to this PUD project. A lot of times I think planning boards and councils think we create an application in a vacuum in a very short time. We started working on the Eagle Lake PUD back in the fall of last year and had a number of informal meetings with staff in the initial concept of our PUD and worked with staff in the development of our plan. Then we went to a formal site review in January with our plan, again, showing it to staff and getting input. And then with that input, then we developed our applications to submit for the March deadline, and then we started working through the process. So we've had a long history with this project of working with staff, and not only with this project, but the previously approved PUD from 2006, which had a residential PUD component that would have allowed short-term rental as well. So there's a long history of that. And with that, I'll conclude. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Mary.
Mary Flowers, Community Unity Consulting. I did want to bring to your attention, P.O. Box 3094, Kalispell. Did want to bring to your attention that your website, your Sterling codifier, which has your code, has apparently been updated to try to update the short-term rental code, the PUD code, but in doing so, it's linking to Wyoming statutes, and so there's a glitch. If you go to just the PUD statute and scroll down, you can read the actual code, but if you click on any of those links, it takes you to other links. So if anybody was trying to access that recently, they probably ran into the same problem I did. So I wanted to bring that to your attention. And again, regarding the Eagle Lake PUD, just to respect that there's been a lot of work gone into this PUD, and I think the issue before you is really the short-term rental issue, and particularly given the policy ramifications that this has not only for this application, but for other similar uses within the city, and to really look at coming into compliance, or not compliance, but consistent with the development that you've approved in this WB2 corridor, which does not allow short-term rentals at this point, and also to really recognize that you have adopted policies since 2008 to implement your growth policy, and how important those policies are to begin to also be reflected in the decisions that you're making. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Further public comment tonight before I close the public comment period? Not seeing any, I'll stay with the audience. Any volunteer board reports from the audience? How about the council? Richard.
We're working on, actually we've finished a rewrite of Appendix C of the Climate Action Plan, which also deals with how we calculate it and the quantification of carbon reductions. Flathead Electric had some questions about that. We've prepared a letter. I'm working with Steve on that tomorrow. We'll send a letter off, the committee will, and I'll send it under my signature as the chair, if that's okay with the rest of the council, to see if they have any further input and see if they have any other comments. And then we will bring it back for an amendment and incorporation into the existent Climate Action Plan.
Thank you, Richard. Other volunteer board reports from the council? Not seeing any, we'll move on to item 6, which is our consent agenda. Any changes or additions to the June 4th meeting minutes, or can I have a motion for approval?
Move to approve the consent agenda.
I'll second.
Seconded by Councilor Williams. Further discussion? All those in favor, please raise your hand. Those opposed, like sign, and that carries unanimously. Michelle? Which brings us on to our 3 public hearings this evening. We will start with item 7A, which I believe will be ordinance 18-18, an ordinance of the City Council of the City of Whitefish, Montana, approving a planned unit development and preliminary plat for the 93 LLC subdivision. This will be on a first reading and will be WPP 18-03, WPUD 18-03. Wendy.
All right, good evening. So you have before you a request for both a preliminary plat and a PUD. Just a little bit of background on this project. The council may recall back in 2007, you folks approved a PUD, or your predecessors, a PUD and a preliminary plat on this property for a total of 119 acres. Then in 2010, this application was amended to look just like it looks right now, with 22 single-family lots, 30 condominiums, and an additional 5 acres for future development. Since that approval in 2010, the applicant requested and received 2 extensions to the subdivision, but in November of last year, the application finally expired, and so that's why they are requesting a new preliminary plat and PUD. Again, the project is a 26-lot subdivision, 22 single-family lots, 30 condominiums on 4 lots, on a total of a little more than 18 acres with a gross density of 2.86 dwelling units per acre. The site is mostly undeveloped with some single-family residents that will be removed as part of the project. The site includes mature trees, along with wetlands and some areas of steep slopes. The subdivision will have 2 accesses off of Highway 93 West that will be connected with a privately owned and maintained loop road, cul-de-sac or T-turnaround within the development itself. The easterly access was constructed by MDT when they reconstructed Highway 93 West several years ago. The 4 multifamily pods, 3 of them are located along the highway, showing kind of a density for each one of them, and then one is located kind of up near the water tank. There's open space areas located throughout the neighborhood with some larger areas that bisect the neighborhood and that include many of the site's environmentally sensitive areas. There's a series of trails throughout the development, and the subdivision has a little more than 5 acres of open space, and the remaining half acre that they need to maintain their 30% open space will be designed into the multifamily lots. In addition to the subdivision, they're proposing a planned unit development. It's needed for the design of the project. They're not asking for any density bonuses. Some of the zoning deviations that they're requesting are to setbacks, lot size, lot coverage, and lot width. In addition, they're asking for a subdivision variance for the street standards. They're kind of varying their private street standards inside there. The project has 3 different zoning designations, WLR, WSR, and RR1. It's surrounded by residential uses. It's served by all public services and facilities. We didn't receive any comments. We did notice all the adjacent landowners, advisory agencies, and place illegal in the paper. So we review subdivisions according to the criteria in the subdivision regulations. Again, access will be off of Highway 93 West. The loop road is proposed to be designed within a 50-foot right-of-way with a 24-foot wide driving surface. In 2007, a traffic impact study was conducted for this project. Staff didn't require an updated TIS because all the recommendations from that original report were implemented, including a left-hand turn lane into the project and then aligning State Park Road with the new entrance there. Staff notified Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, and we didn't receive any comments from them. This area is not within an area identified as having high groundwater. There are some areas of steep slopes, but most of those areas are outside of lots and roads, and they're located within open space areas. There's a series of wetlands along the north side of the project, and they're proposing to enhance them and utilize them as part of their stormwater management and part of their open space areas. They're proposing to use buffer averaging to meet the buffer requirements in the regulations, and we have recommended a condition of approval that the final wetland restoration plan and buffer averaging be reviewed and approved by the city. Stormwater facilities can be located in the outer 25% of wetland buffers, as you all know, provided there's no less impactful location and mitigation is provided. Staff is recommending a condition of approval requiring the applicant to work with a wetland expert to ensure the stormwater management plan meets all of the requirements of the water quality protection regulations. There is a stormwater conveyance, but it's located off this particular part where the subdivision is. It's on the adjacent 5 acres, the WRR1. The applicant's proposing to employ low-impact development techniques as part of their overall stormwater plan. They'll construct a drainage system to meet all the city's standards. Staff is recommending a condition of approval requiring the applicant to work, again, with the wetland expert to make sure it all meets our particular standards. As in the previous approvals, we recommended a condition that the trees in the multifamily pods aren't removed until such time that they actually have a permit from the city. So we'll continue that condition. Again, water, sewer, streets are all available. They're exempt from parkland dedication because they're providing more open space than would be required through a subdivision. This project is being reviewed under the former PUD because they submitted it before the new PUD went into effect on May 2nd. So under the PUD chapter, they are preserving and enhancing environmentally sensitive areas. They're setting those areas aside. For those of you that were here back in 2007 with this project, this is one of the first projects that actually, really took stock of the type of environmentally sensitive areas they had on site and set those areas aside and provided buffers around them. So this subdivision really became kind of a bit of a model for some of our future subdivisions, and we use them as an example for folks that were proposing development. As far as the rest of the PUD standards, providing usable open space, they are proposing a series of trails throughout the open space areas. There's landscaping buffers being proposed along the south and east property lines, and mature trees outside the building envelopes will be preserved. There's no streets to connect to this subdivision. It's surrounded by, mostly Grouse Mountain and other privately owned properties. But all of their streets will be open to the public, even though they'll be privately owned. Providing pedestrian and bicycle facilities. With the improvements of Highway 93 West, this property's really now has total access to the downtown and to the Whitefish trails. The sidewalk comes right up to this, the easterly exit entrance into this project. The Public Works Department requested a sidewalk be installed along all of the highway frontage on Highway 93 West to their other entrance. Under providing affordable housing, they're not asking for a density bonus, so they don't have to provide affordable housing. And they are providing a variety of housing types, both single-family, duplex, and triplex within the project. The Planning Board held a public hearing on May 17th and recommended approval of the project, subject to 32 conditions. The applicant is represented over there, and staff also recommended approval to the zoning deviations and subdivision variance. So just to hit some highlights of some of those conditions. Again, no healthy trees can be removed from the multifamily pods until they get a conditional use permit. We would like to see them work with a wetland expert to review their stormwater management plan. We want to review their final wetland buffer averaging and restoration plan. They're going to dedicate a little more than half an acre of property to the city of Whitefish where the water tank is on the south side of the project. Currently, it's located within an easement. We're recommending a 5-foot wide concrete sidewalk and boulevard be added along the Highway 93 West frontage that would connect this easterly entrance to Mountainside Drive on the west. The Public Works Department requested a landscape architect with experience in low-impact development design be consulted as part of the drainage design. And then if high groundwater is determined to be within 6 feet, a note would be placed on the face of the plat. And then finally, development of the multifamily pods would require a conditional use permit. And the density that's in the preliminary plat is what would be permitted. Can answer any questions for you.
Thanks, Wendy. Any questions for Wendy? Richard?
Yeah, Wendy, just so the public knows too, I think, but you said that the roads would be open to the public,
Yep.
and as I recall, the trails will also be open to the public?
I don't remember. Good question for the applicant.
Okay. The applicant is here.
I think Rado can address that question when he
Okay.
presents
Yep.
to the council.
So just let you know. And a question for Chief Page.
Please.
The fire department characteristically does not care for cul-de-sacs and T turnarounds. Are these acceptable to the fire department?
Yeah, Travis reviewed this plan and they're all acceptable.
Okay.
I would prefer not, but
That's it.
Further, Richard, or Frank, excuse me. Been working with you guys too long.
Wendy, just because it's a recent issue, to the extent these are private roads, is there a provision in here that they shall not ever be gated? And gates-
That's in the subdivision regulations,
so no-
so they can't be gated.
Great, thank you.
Further questions for Wendy? Rado, would you like to approach the council and just name and address for the record, please?
Thank you, Your Worship. My name is Rayto Barrington. I actually reside in Fernie, British Columbia, but we also have a home on this property, 1759 Highway 93 North. Thank you for allowing me to speak. My typical custom is to not make a presentation, but to reserve the right to speak to rebuttal in the event that there are comments made during the public comment period which require clarification. I will answer the one question from Councillor Hildner, which is that those trail systems are intended to be open to the public as well. I can also point out that, and I am obviously during the rebuttal period or now available to answer any questions that council may have. Our consultant, Eric Mulcahy, is here and may wish to make some comments. Eric, I'll leave that up to you as to whether or not you choose to do that. And so unless there's any questions, I'll reserve my comments for the rebuttal.
Any questions for Rado at this time?
No, you answered my question. Thank you.
For the record, I did see on page 51 of the packet, I think it was a comment made during the planning board hearing that, quote, River Design Group will be on standby for assistance with water quality related issues if they do arise. We are not on retainer, under retainer, nor will be retained by this developer. For the record, I do not have a conflict of interest, nor will I, through my ownership of River Design Group. With that said, Eric, did you have anything to add? No, but I'd be available. Thank you. We did advertise for a public hearing on what will be ordinance 18-18, and we'll hold that public hearing now. Anyone wishing to provide public comment, please do so, and your name and address for the record, please.
Rebecca Norton, 530 Scott Avenue. My main concern about this project, besides the old data, is that we are actually in climate change, and I'm not sure that we actually are modeling water based on how that's going to look as it builds out. And so I'm wondering if there's a way to do that. I'm sure there's experts that can do that. When we look at high groundwater, we look at the 100-year floodplain kind of thing, and I'm wondering how we model early melt-off, since that's probably what's going to be our biggest issue with excessive snow loads. And I talked to Michael Jameson, who is a neighbor of mine, and I was telling him that this project might impact him because the water actually comes right to where he just built a house, and they did some restoration work there so that it looks natural going down to the river. And he mentioned that every spring there's a really huge plume of algae because the water comes from the golf course and brings with it the, not herbicides, what are they? The things that you put on grass to make weeds die, and fertilizing and all that stuff. So then it got me thinking about that section of the river too, because we've essentially had two slumps there. One is 2 houses away from Michael's, because that came up when our neighborhood was being developed. And there was a cited slumpage because the man that lived there brought in fill illegally, and then he had to get an after-the-fact permit for that. And then right next to him is where the river crossing thing is. There was a major slump after the most recent build-out where they had to bring in a heavy piece of equipment and ram metal in to hold the, sorry, this isn't my line of expertise, the ground in, because the house was actually falling into the river and changing where it was supposed to be. So on the second one, there was a geotech survey done, and I did confirm that with the city. I tried to call the developer at the time to confirm that they had actually done the secondary part of that, but nobody ever tells you that part. But it did fail, even with the engineering that was done, that was required by the city. And so if the concern I have is during the public hearing with the planning board is, I think it's a cool design to use swales, but we've only had 2 of those in the city. And in one of the subdivisions, there was water damage after the build out, because I know people that were in that neighborhood and they had water issues even though they were brand new houses. So when we went through the public process, I asked, are there standards that we could set as a city for these bioswales to make sure that later on we're not inheriting a water issue that's being passed down underneath the golf course down into Whitefish River and destabilizing the bank as well. And so their consultant said that there are standards available in other areas, we just don't have them here. And so I'm wondering if we could have a condition that those standards be looked at by our staff and have ways of addressing that so that we're not creating issues when we're going to have high melt off, because I went to a talk once and many glacier melted off in January, and that was like 5 years ago. And so we could be dealing with a lot of water early on and at unexpected times. And so she knows about them, and I just was wondering if we could have that be part of the condition. And then the second thing is, I think the languaging around the deed restrictions needs to say that it will happen, not that it could happen. So that in the conditions, one of it says, I think it says could or should maybe or something, and it really, most of the time when we're enforcing deed restrictions to be written into the county record, that there's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. We just make sure that gets done. So other than that, it's an exciting project. But I'm always worried about water in our city, and so I just wanted to ask if we could ensure that there was like a standards applied to this bioswale stuff so that we make sure it works, and if not, if it fails, what do we do about that, since it's a new technology? And I just remembered when we went through the critical areas ordinance and the guy came up with the matrix, and benefited quite a bit financially from that personally, but it didn't really work because nobody else had worked with that concept. So I think if you're going to introduce new technology and how we build things, we should make sure that we have high standards of making sure they actually work in this environment. So I hope that made sense. All right, thank you.
Thanks, Rebecca. Further public testimony on this item tonight? Further public comments? Not seeing any, I'll go ahead and close the public hearing and turn it back to the council for a motion or discussion. Richard.
I'll go ahead and move to approve Ordinance 1818, an ordinance for the City Council of the City of Whitefish, Montana, approving planned unit development preliminary plot for the 93 LLC subdivision, subject to findings of fact and 32 conditions.
Is there a second to the motion?
I'll second.
Seconded by Ryan. Further discussion on the motion? I'll briefly comment. I was actually on council both in 2007 and 2010 when this came back before us, and as Wendy indicated, this project did very much honor our critical areas ordinance and the level of detail that went into the layout to help, mitigate water quality impacts, both from a stormwater standpoint, wetland, and both the conveyance setbacks was great at the time, and it remains the case today. So I'm personally very comfortable seeing this project move forward as designed. All those in favor of the motion, please raise your hand. And those opposed, like sign, and that carries unanimously as well, Michelle. Thanks, Rita. Did you really call me your worship? I'm honored. It's a first, though.
I always made you say it. Because you're from Canada.
We'll move on to item 7B, which will be ordinance 18-19, an ordinance of the City of Whitefish amending zoning regulations in Whitefish City Code, Title 11, Chapter 5 regarding sign regulations, and Chapter 9 regarding definitions, and this will be on a first reading. Dave.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. So I'm just going to direct you to the staff report on page 291 of your packet. So in 2015, there was a Supreme Court case, Reed versus Gilbert, that clarified when municipalities might impose content-based restrictions on signage. After that Supreme Court ruling, many cities around the country have been amending their sign code to remove references to content-based signs, particularly where temporary signs are involved. If you have to read the sign to determine what type of a sign you're regulating, then it's content-based. And so our current code had many references to signs such as campaign and election signs, contractor signs, yard sale signs, political signs, and other types of signs that you'd have to read to identify. So we can regulate the time and the place and the manner of signage, just not the content, which is protected under freedom of speech. I don't know, Andy, did you want to add anything on that, Reed versus Gilbert? I think we've talked about it a little bit in the work session, so.
Yeah, we have talked about it a lot in work sessions, and it's just if you have to read the sign to see if it's content-based, then it's not going to survive strict scrutiny. So Dave and I Dave did the bulk of the work and went through and tried to remove the content-based regulations in our sign ordinance. Unless you will really want me to get into the constitutional arguments, I don't think that will probably interest anyone.
So many of the signs that we needed to change are under our exempt category, which doesn't require a sign permit. And so there's signs that people can put up and take down without us necessarily regulating them, as long as they meet the location and the size of the sign restrictions. A lot of those types of signs went through a lot of scrutiny over the years of with regard to how they're regulated, and so we tried to minimize changes to those things, but in some cases there was some necessary changes. We also had a couple of just small housekeeping changes of things that over the years were either difficult to interpret, had been needed to be clarified, or may have had errors in them, and so I'll kind of go over those briefly. So if you want to refer to Exhibit A under page 252, I'm just going to kind of go through the majority of these changes. I won't necessarily hit every single one, since we've spent quite a bit of time with this, with the work session with you guys, but there was some old language under 1152 that referenced the planning jurisdiction, and so that was removed. Later on, under we added a new C, which is a substitution clause. This is something that Angie felt like we needed to add, and it basically states that any sign allowed under this chapter may contain, in lieu of any other message or copy, any lawful non-commercial message that does not direct attention to a business operated for profit, or a product or a commodity or a service for sale or lease, or to any other commercial interest or activity, so long as the sign complies with the size, height, area, and other requirements. And that was something that came out of that Supreme Court ruling, just to protect a commercial business. If they wanted to use their sign for free speech, they'd be able to. And then under 1154, exempt prohibited special standards, we had quite a few changes in those. On-site traffic directional info signs were now lumped all together into a incidental sign. We clarified signs that can't be read from a public right-of-way. We had to modify some language on signs that identify housing complexes or apartment complexes to make them content neutral. And a lot of the ways that we modified these things were to make it based on what was happening on the site, of the location, rather than the actual content of the sign. Subdivision entrance signs, there was a clarification needed because it stated clearly that there only one was allowed, and then later it talked about a second sign. Again, we lumped quite a few different types of small signs into incidental sign category, and we added a new definition that kind of covered them, so you have a better idea what those are. We added a type of sign called a non-commercial sign, which replaces political signs and other signs without commercial advertising that are allowed by right as free speech. We reduced the allowed sign area in residential areas of those, but there's no limit on the number of such signs, and they don't have a time limit on them. But in the past, quite a bit larger sign was allowed in residential districts. So right now, the change is to 6 square feet for residential and resort residential zone properties, and then up to 32 square feet in commercial and industrial zones. The other bigger thing that we added, there was a number of event-related temporary signs listed in the existing code, and we put them all under one header based on the varying activities, not the content, and stating that they must be removed at the completion of the activity. So currently, we added land use action signs as something that we put up if there's a subdivision that wasn't listed in the code as an exemption. Temporary wide city event signs that must be authorized by the manager or the city council. We included those in there. And previously there was criteria based on the content of those signs, so we took that out and modified that. Signs located on construction sites, made those content neutral. Election signs, those were somewhat modified. Just in researching this, we weren't able to set a time when, or a limit on when they can be put up before an election, but we are still allowed to keep our ability for them to come down after an election's over. Signs for sale, for rent, open house, they're now related to the activity rather than the content. Same with yard sale and seasonal signs. The temporary business, like signs for going out of business sales or other things. People put up the banners. We moved them down to special standards. For some reason, they were under the exempt signs, but yet they do require a sign permit from us, so that was a little bit confusing. And so we added a new section for those so that we could require a sign permit, since we do, and we didn't really change the language of that, but I'll talk about that in a second. Changeable copy signs for religious assemblies or convention centers, those are both also moved to the special standards because a permit's required for those, and they were listed under exempt signs. And then we had a sign called a neighborhood identification sign, which was really kind of identifying commercial districts, and those became obsolete when we replaced those with our wayfinding signage that we put up downtown. So we removed the references to those in the code. Under 1154B10, we added the word commercial in front of billboards just to clarify on billboards. And then one of the things that we added to this, which was a prohibition on what we were calling human signs. And those are basically the sign walker, someone walking around with a commercial advertisement in front of a business. You still are allowed the freedom of speech if you have a non-commercial message. But this was something that we added in there for your consideration. We added another catch-all prohibiting signs that aren't mentioned in the code. And as I mentioned on the temporary commercial event signs, there was a little bit of a clarification on the time limit. It talks about twice per year, 12 months, and we just made it a little clearer what that meant because we've had people question the intent in that. And then we moved it to that special section. Under general sign standards, one of the things we added, there was some properties or commercial properties are allowed a separate sign on the back of a building to add towards and it's exempt from the sign calculations. However, it wasn't clear that it needed to be a public entrance to get the sign on there, so we just in a bunch of different sections under each of the different districts, we added the word public to rear entrance signs just to clarify that. In the highway district, we added a clarification that ground-mounted sign totals are based on the property frontage rather than building frontage. It wasn't clear in the code. There's a couple other minor changes on that I mentioned on the alley entrance signs. In the Old Town Sign District, again, the alley entrance signs, and a note that made it clear that it doesn't count towards the sign allowance. Portable A-frame signs is a sign that we've had some issues with. We still haven't resolved all those things. We had a couple meetings with Heart of Whitefish to talk about that. We want to get together with some of the downtown business owners to clarify parts of that code. It talks about one per developed site, and there's no definition of developed site. Historically, we've allowed them to be one per business with ground floor frontage. That needs to still be clarified. However, we also wanted to clarify some things with regard to the measurement and the limitations on them. And so we added some language in there to clarify that. Again, I mentioned neighborhood identification signs. They're mentioned under the Old Town District, and that whole section was taken out. In the Business Service District, again, ground-mounted signs with regard to property frontage rather than building frontage. And then there was a section in there on community-wide promotion signs that was totally out of place, and so we took that out. Excuse me. Under administration, 1157A, we clarified that multiple tenant building signs that were designed to have replaceable panels, they don't need a new sign permit when one panel's changed if a new tenant moves in. So signs like they have at Riverside Plaza and some of those other areas, it's basically just a metal panel. They're all exactly the same. They just have different content on them. Just made it easier for those kinds of businesses to do that without having to come back in and get a sign permit. And the last section that we changed is the definitions. We had to add and clarify several definitions in the code. Under banner sign, we clarified that definition, and then based on the work session that we had a couple weeks ago, we added some language that would prohibit feather-style banners on a single post, something that Councilor Hildner brought up. And so if you're comfortable with that language, that would not allow those types of signs to be considered a banner sign. That's under the definition. Again, we defined building frontage. That was something that was not defined in the code. Removes a lot of those temporary signs that were all lumped together, campaign signs, construction signs, election signs, all those things were things that were content-based. We added a new definition of commercial signs, and that's something that we are allowed to regulate, commercial versus non-commercial. And that new language is a sign or a banner that contains text or graphics designed proposing or promoting a commercial transaction or directing attention to a business, commodity, or service. Again, we added a definition of human signs, as I mentioned, which is a sign that's held or worn by a person, including but not limited to a human directional, sign walkers, wavers, twirlers, and sandwich persons. Human sign does not include text or images displayed on a traditional article of clothing, such as a jacket, shirt, pants, or hat. And again, that would not apply to non-commercial speech. Incidental signs, I mentioned that we lumped a bunch of them together under that category. And we kind of listed the types of signs that would be there, including traffic, directional signs, commemorative plaques, addresses, building names, property owner, or signs that inform the public of goods or services available, like a credit card sign or open or closed signs. So that kind of covers a catch-all for all those types of things. We had to remove a bunch of other definitions, neighborhood identification signs, political signs, real estate signs. Under temporary signs, the old definition was based on the content. We changed that to the type of sign, the construction of it, which is constructed of vinyl, plastic, wood, or metal, designed to be displayed for a short period of time. So that's kind of the overall. The last one was temporary commercial event signs, and then we added a new definition on that, which I'm not sure where my copy of that is. Let's see here. So a sign or attractant of a non-permanent nature for commercial use, used only temporarily and not permanently mounted. So this proposed amendment went to a workshop with the planning board and also went to a public hearing. They reviewed the findings of fact, that it was in accordance with the growth policy. Some of the other criteria didn't really apply as far as securing from public safety, although safety signs are exempt. It is, of course, all signage helps conserve the value of buildings and aesthetics in the community. Staff recommended approval of these changes to the planning board. Again, you guys held a work session on it as well. We had no public comments on this when it went to the planning board. And one other thing, Richard had a comment at the work session about looking into signs along the Whitefish River and how we might regulate them. There was a sign up on the river which is being taken down. It was left up during construction and then they forgot to remove it down there. But when we reviewed that and looked at how we might clarify that, we looked into how we might do some kind of like a river sign district. The Whitefish River, however, passes through many different types of sign districts. It goes through the Old Town Sign District, it goes through the Highway District, it goes through our Resort District, and all our signs are categorized that way. So we thought that the best way to do this without a major change to these housekeeping items was to introduce something within our water quality ordinance. Currently, our lakeshore regulations have a setback for signage, and we could do the same thing with our water quality ordinance, either ban them completely within the buffer or set a size limit on the size of signs that can go in there. I know that there's several properties that when they're listed on the market to sell, a lot of times they put a sign on the river so that someone can see that amenity while they're boating or passing by there. And so we'd probably need to, if we did come up with some proposed language, sort of vet that through the Realty Association just to see, get some comments from them so that we can try to accommodate some of their concerns. And that is my staff report. Do you guys have questions for me?
Thanks, Dave. Any questions? Andy?
Yeah, Dave, something caught my eye in here, and I'm not going to single out this specific project because I think we as a city were guilty of this, but on page 256, under the construction sign where it says multiple contractors on a single development site are entitled to display signage provided is consolidated on a single sign, does not exceed 32 square feet per face. So I'm wondering how the 8 individual signs hanging on the fence at the Stack project would
Yeah, it probably
be in
doesn't comply to
compliance
that. And again, we had that on City Hall where we then
Yeah, we
the
did same thing at City
contractors
Hall,
consolidate
and
that.
it's the Marriott out there too, so I think that's more
Yep, it's an enforcement
issue.
thing,
Yeah.
for sure, and yeah, it's one of those things that,
But I am reading that correctly. It's
yep.
a single
It's
sign.
single
that's-
sign, and they have to fit it all on there, yep. I mean, it could be two-sided per face, but yeah,
Okay.
yep.
Richard, question?
Yes. When you were talking about human signs, it's something I brought up at planning and at the work session, but I want to just be absolutely sure that when we talk about spinners, human spinners, we're also referring to mechanical spinners that do that kind of advertising, whether robotically or.
We already banned those in our temporary sign. It
Okay.
can only be things that are moved by natural air. They can't have a mechanical movement, either a air compressor or anything else that makes them move. Even if it's a balloon that moves in the wind, I mean, that's not regulated, but our code currently already talks about inflated objects intended as an attraction which is affected by the natural movement of the air may be temporarily allowed. So, anything that's mechanically moved would not be allowed as a temporary sign.
All right.
Additional questions? Frank?
Dave, was there any thought or consideration given to the idea that if a business wanted to apply for a special temporary sign, they had the right to do that twice a year for no longer than 30 days? One issue that was raised with me was, if I'm going to have a temporary sign of balloons, why do I need a permit for that? And, because the cost of the sign is a whole lot less than the permit. Is there a way, did we ever discuss or think about how we wanted to manage that? Because I don't want to disincent people for applying for, essentially saying, I'm going to have a temporary sign, because we want to know about it, and hopefully invite them to comply with our regulations, and yet at the same time having to apply for two, even within 1 year, depending upon what the temporary sign is, kind of can be cost ineffective. Do we give any thought to that?
We looked into that. I mean, this temporary sign code, went through a lot of consternation through the council over the years, and it was one of those things that we really didn't want to muck around with it in this change and try to keep it intact. I mean, there was a lot of issues with some of the car dealerships putting up balloons all over the place, which is why those were included in there. And there was additional language in there that I think John Phelps added, that balloons are specifically allowed as a temporary sign. I think because of some of the conflict that we'd had with some of the car dealerships. So it's our sign code is a one-size-fit-all. There's, it's kind of tough, if someone downtown wants to put a balloon on their A-frame sign, that we wouldn't allow that. But because they're included they're an attractant, they attract people to their business, they're considered a sign, and they're a temporary item, so they kind of have to fall under our general standards. And it is, a little cost prohibitive for a sign permit for those things. I mean, we could maybe set a separate fee or something like that, but I don't know how we'd want to break that out so it's a different time frame or a different amount of time that would be allowed for those, because then we just see a big proliferation of balloons everywhere. We don't really regulate the size of them, a small little party balloon, or it could be, a blimp-sized balloon, so.
No, I hear you. I guess my thought on it is that I think it's, okay, it's one thing if the car dealership wants to put 100 balloons around their place for a weekend or whatever they want to do for their temporary sign. That's a magnitude of difference than 4 balloons on a sandwich board on Central Avenue. And in terms of applying for temporary sign permits and again, trying to get people to sign up and comply, I think we ought to give some thought to how we make the fee schedule or the process much more abbreviated under those circumstances, because I think that's the complaint I've heard, and that I just think there's a way to address that, and I'd just like you to work on that if that's possible.
Further comments or questions for Dave? Not seeing any. We did advertise for a public hearing on what will be our own ordinance 18-19, and we'll hold that public hearing now. Any public testimony tonight on this item? Any public comments? Not seeing any. I'll close the public hearing and turn it back to the council for a motion. Frank?
I will move to approve ordinance 1819, an ordinance of the city of Whitefish, Montana, amending zoning regulations in the Whitefish City Code, Title 11, Chapter 5 regarding sign regulations, and Chapter 9 regarding definitions, first reading.
Is there a second to the motion?
I'll second.
Seconded by Councilor Fury. Further discussion? Frank?
David, I'm moving to approve this, but I am doing it predicated on our discussion here this evening, that we're going to have further discussions on that one in particular in terms of our cost of permits and how they apply for such small, what I call almost de minimis temporary signs. Are we agreed?
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Frank. Further comments? All those in favor, please raise your hand. And those opposed, like sign, and that carries unanimously. Michelle. Thanks, Dave. We'll move on to item 7C, which will be consideration of approving the city manager's proposed budget as the FY19 preliminary budget and setting the final public hearing on the FY19 budget for August 20th, 2018, and this appears on page 332 of your packet. Adam.
All right, so just a couple of thoughts as we get into the season. Now, obviously, we don't have all our numbers back from the state. We get those in early August, and so we'll be able to refine things to do the official budget in August. But this does get us up and running as of July 1st. So this is something that we're looking for you to approve. A couple things I wanted to point out, just kind of going through some of my memo. I know it shows there's a 5.77 increase in revenue, but that's not necessarily the increase that we're passing to the taxpayer. 3.2% of that is net new construction. So that's new people coming on. They're going to pay taxes in addition to everyone else paying taxes. And so they help share that burden. So that's one thing I think is important to note. We are looking to up our cash balances a little bit. This has been one of the goals, one of the 3 financial goals that I have for the city. We're currently hanging around the 15%. We really should be in the 20 to 25% reserves in our fund balance. That's typical from what other cities do, and it does represent sound financial practices. We are continuing to look at ways to improve our capital improvement program. There's a lot of things that we want to take care of. I know we've talked about some water leakage and things of that nature that we're trying to get a handle on. We're going to be doing a more aggressive effort in leak detection and trying to correct these. I know Craig did a great job this last year, and I think we probably, at least by his estimates, have come down at least 5% in some of our water loss. So we're continuing to do that. It is also important to note that the industry average is about 15 to 20% for water loss in municipal systems. And I know that sounds like a lot, and it is a lot, but when you're burying pipes underground, it's really hard to tell, you know, what is sealed, what isn't, especially after decades and decades pass. But nevertheless, we want to do a better job and at least get down into the average range. And if we can continue to improve our aging infrastructure, maybe we can even get into even less over time. So we're looking at some assessment increases. We're just going along with consumer price index for these increases. We did look for a little bit more on the parks maintenance side of things. That's an area where I know we need to do a better job of getting some funding in order to address some of the parks and trails and river access and things that we have. I think we do a great job of gathering and garnering donations for capital projects. And we rarely get donations for the ongoing operation and maintenance of these things. So that's something we need to be taking a look at. That increase is 6%. Kind of sounds like a lot as a percentage, but it's really a little over $1 a year on a tax bill. So it is not much. We're looking at a stormwater assessment. This was something that I talked heavily about last year. Trying to get stormwater to be an actual self-balancing fund, or at least a proper self-balancing fund. I mean, it's self-balancing in the sense that the expenditures match the revenues. However, the only reason that has happened is because we moved all of the salaries and personnel costs out of stormwater over into streets. And so by moving some of that back, it does cause an increase there. I will note that in the reduction of the personnel side on the street side, that freed up money, and I believe almost all of that money is going back into capital improvements, or at least, because I don't think, we don't count a mill and overlay as a capital improvement, do we? Yeah. But nevertheless, it goes back into what we can see on the ground. So I know Craig is upping his mill and overlay of streets by about $50,000 this year. We're looking at improving our snow plowing efforts. Alleys have been something that have plagued us the last few years. They tend to be a low priority item, yet a lot of people drive on the alleys early in the morning and then throughout the day, and by the time we get to them, all the snow is packed down and there's not much we can do with it. And it just continues to become more and more of a mess. So that's something we're looking at doing. I know Craig's allocated some money for that. We are also looking at bringing forward to the council a change in how we do our plowing. And essentially, it's going to involve a change in parking for residents. And I think we're going to go with an alternate side parking, where on even days you can park on even sides of the street, and on odd days you park on odd sides of the street. And that'll allow a plow truck to get down the road. I know when we did the council orientation day, we had 4 or 5 of you in a vehicle driving around, and there was still a lot of snow on the ground. And so I think when we got to, I think it was Summers, there was cars parked on both sides of the road, and we could barely get the car through, much less a plow truck. So we think by getting all of the cars onto one side, we can actually get a plow truck down the road. Then the very next day when the cars move over to the plowed section, we'll be able to do a better job, butting up against the curb. So that's something we're looking at doing as well. We are looking at a few personnel changes. We've talked about these at length. I probably won't go into it a whole lot of detail, but we're looking for an IT administrator. We're looking for a housing coordinator. That's still something that I'm working on with the Housing Authority. I'm putting it in the budget here, and it's either someone we can hire and become one of our personnel, or we can Housing Authority can hire and we can make a contribution to the Housing Authority. The whole process here is we're really going gangbusters. We're going faster essentially than the Housing Authority can keep up. But nevertheless, the Housing Authority, I know, is committed to improving their capacity and ability to tackle the housing things that we are working on here in the city. So we're kind of trying to get to the bottom of a 5-year plan that can kind of phase the city out of these kind of things, so that hopefully in 5 years from now, the Housing Authority will be able to take on all the housing needs that we have. And of course, when we came up with that strategic housing plan at the end of 2017, there's a lot of initiatives in there. And so we've got to come a long ways in a short period of time, but I think by so doing, I think we're all going to end up being better for it, and I think the housing will be with the Housing Authority where housing programs should be. But there's just going to be that overlap as we continue to work together to try to make these things happen. We are hiring another police officer. This does bring our police officer total to 17. This really is a backfill for an officer that we're going to be donating to the Internet Crimes Against Children program that the state has. That officer will be housed at the Homeland Security office in Kalispell. It still takes us from 16 to 17. So we're still going to pay for that Internet Crimes Against Children officer. It still comes out of our payroll, still on our benefits and everything else. However, we do receive a donation in the amount of what a full-time officer would be. So it ends up being kind of a budgetary neutral thing, but as it shows on our rolls, we will have an extra police officer. We are looking for some customer service help. When we moved into the facility, we felt we really needed some extra help down at the front desk. But we thought, let's just kind of ride it out and see how things go for a little bit. But clearly, we're recognizing the need for some additional help. There's a lot of things that front desk clerk does other than just answer phones and take money. There's a lot of projects and everything else that they do, and they're just not able to get to everything or more projects that are kind of coming down the pipeline. So what this will do is this will free that person up to come back, just kind of slide back into a desk that's already behind that front desk, and allow someone to come in and be able to take money and answer phones to free up that person to handle projects. We're just looking at 25 hours a week for that position. And we did have increased staffing costs for our AIS stations, but it sounds like that we're doing a great job there. I think we and WLI did a great job of doing some public outreach last year. And while there have been a couple complaints over this, that, and the other, for the most part, it was a resounding success. I think we, correct me if I'm wrong, Maria, but 5,800 boats, I think. We inspected something like that last year. And so if we can do the best job we possibly can to delay AIS entering our waters, we ought to do that. And so I think we're doing a great job there. But there are costs associated with that. A couple things to point out on like the overall. I know the overall shows a $4.8 million increase in revenues. And I just want to make sure the public understands that that doesn't necessarily mean that there's $4.8 million of increases that have to come down the pipeline, whether by property tax increases or fees. It's important to note that we're borrowing $2 million. That $2 million is kind of the main kickoff to our wastewater treatment plant upgrades. So that'll be a borrowed amount. We are seeing a $900,000 increase in our TIF revenues, and that's coming from just all the expansion and development and things that we're seeing in our TIF district. We're seeing an extra $200,000 come in from the gas tax. I believe this will be the first year that we receive a full amount for that gas tax that was recently passed by the state legislature. So there's $200,000 that's coming from there. We're seeing about a $250,000 increase in resort tax. So there's a lot of amounts that go into there that isn't necessarily rolled down to represent an increase. One of the things to kind of talk about, I wanted to touch on the three main financial things. So having that fund balance, which is something I touched on, improving our capital improvement program is something I've touched on. The final thing is unfunded liabilities. We have some unfunded liabilities, and they come by way of, an employee being able to rack up comp time. So under state law, we have caps on vacation and things like that, but we don't on comp time. So there are comp time, so if someone works overtime, they can either take it in cash or they can take it in comp time. If they take it in comp time, it just banks up. And so we have some employees with like 1,600 hours of comp time. And of course, each year, with raises and over the course of a career, those per dollar amounts go up quite a bit. Typically, we see these in our protective forces for police and fire. They have to operate at a top level, so if they twist an ankle or anything else, well, if I twisted my ankle, I'll be to work tomorrow. They twist their ankle, they can't come into work. And so it's easy for them to have to, come off duty in order to, when something little like that happens. So they like to be able to bank up these hours in case there's something like that. They can rely upon them to maintain their paycheck at an equal level. Nevertheless, even though that is the desire, it is something that we need to handle on our end. So by increasing our fund balance, we're able to increase our amounts. We're trying to plan for retirements when we know that they're coming so that we can try and budget for those so that it doesn't become quite a shock to the financial system, so to speak, when all of a sudden someone retires and you have a larger payout of these hours. So that's something we're trying to address in this budget. But I think in the end, there are a lot of demands, there are a lot of things going on. We are a growing city. We're seeing increases in call volume from fire to police and just wear and tear on our roads from tourists and everything else. And so these kind of things are requiring our efforts to try to combat. And so we're trying to do it in an efficient way. And so we think that what Dana and I have brought forward is the most efficient way to tackle the tasks that are ahead of us. And so we urge you to approve the budget.
Thank you, Adam. Any questions? Dana, excuse me.
I'm just going to clarify one thing that Adam said. Our comp time is actually capped. It was personal time that he was referencing. And so often that's from our police and fire who earn holiday pay. They're on call basically 24 hours and they work, 7 days a week. So they do get additional holiday pay that's where we're seeing the rack up, not so much the comp time. So.
Okay. Thanks for the clarification. Questions for Adam or Dana on the FY19 preliminary budget? Not seeing any. We did advertise for a public hearing on what will be basically adopting the FY19 preliminary budget and setting the final public hearing on the budget for August 20th, 2018. We'll hold that public hearing now. Any public testimony on the proposed budget? Public testimony? Not seeing any, I'll close the public hearing and turn it back to council for a motion. Andy.
I would move that we adopt the fiscal year 19 preliminary budget and set our final public hearing for the fiscal 19 budget for August 20th, 2018.
Is there a second to the motion?
I'll second.
Seconded by Councilor Williams. Comments on the motion? Not seeing any. I'll just real briefly, I just wanted to thank the department directors, Dana, I know you worked tirelessly on this budget along with Adam. I think it's clear compared to past years, it's concise, and I really appreciated the effort that went into presenting the data in both graphical and chart formats, which I think you expanded on compared to past years. And municipal budgets are much different in terms of understanding municipal budgets compared to private sector budgets. And I don't think that's something the general public understands. As in past years, Dana, and I haven't asked this request because I know you've been busy just getting the budget to this point, but in the past I have asked that we prepare a range of scenarios looking at different values for both commercial as well as residential homes in town. And given the increase in mills that we're going to be levying in FY19 plus the increase in assessments, I was just hoping we could have a few different scenarios brought back a couple weeks in advance of our final adoption, if that's not too much to ask, just so we have a good snapshot of what the impact to our taxpayers will be.
Yeah, that's not a problem. I've basically done that for the residential already. Commercial gets a little bit trickier, but we could definitely come up with an estimate for those. The value part is the hard part for commercial because they're often sales-based when they do their market value appraisal. But I could at least look and see what it is. I don't know how much commercial changes. But for, you know, an average home, obviously we did have, the Daily Interlake ran an article regarding our budget of a $200,000 valued property. And of that, 1 mil equates to about $2.70 per year. So when you're talking about a 3.27 mil increase on the property tax side, it's pretty small. It's, you know, less than a quarter a month for 1 mil. So you could calculate that out to less than $1. But as for the other assessments, obviously the larger assessment is the stormwater increase, but you're looking at, I would say our home value is probably closer to $300,000 versus $200,000, so I'll give us that. But we're looking at about an increase of $5.76 a month, so about a latte a month. But you're also getting additional services with that. So.
Great. Thanks, Dana. I appreciate that. Further comments or discussion? All those in favor of the motion, please raise your hand. Those opposed, like sign, and the motion does carry unanimously. Which moves us on to item 8, communications from our planning and building director. This is a continuation from a postponement from the June 4th, 2018 meeting. This will be item 8A and will be ordinance 18-16, an ordinance of the City Council of the City of Whitefish approving the Eagle Lake planned unit development to develop 16 condominiums and 10 buildings on one parcel comprising 7.163 acres of land located at 6405 Highway 93 South in Whitefish, and this will be on a second reading. Dave.
I actually think Wendy was going to talk on this one.
Wendy.
I would just clarify, it's 60 units, not 16.
Thought I said 60.
So I put together a memo hoping to answer a lot of your questions. Angie also put together a memo. So at the last council meeting, you pulled this item from the consent agenda for the second reading to further review the possible use of residential units for short-term rental. That was one of your questions. Your other question was, could the council add a condition of approval to prohibit short-term rentals? And then the final item, which Angie has addressed, was the city's legal position on the attempted appeal from Mary Flowers. So I can go through my memo, or if you have any questions about it.
What's your preference? Would you like Wendy to walk through her staff report, or do you have any questions for Wendy?
Or Angie, too.
Not seeing any questions or a desire for her to walk through her staff report, or?
I think for the public's purpose, it would be helpful. I mean, it was a well-done memo, Wendy. I think it'd be helpful for the public to have that as much as anything else, if you would. Thank you.
Okay, so just as some background, I provided some information that we've had resort residential zoning districts. So I think there was kind of a question, is short-term rental really a residential use, or is it more of a commercial use? How can you apply for a PUD for residential PUD when you're asking for possibly the ability to do short-term rental? So we've had resort residential zoning districts since the early 80s. These districts permit overnight rentals and a variety of ownership arrangements within a dwelling unit. And all these permitted uses are identified in the resort residential districts under the residential category. They're not considered a commercial type use. These are also permitted in zoning districts that don't permit any commercial uses, such as our resort residential uses. So they're specifically called out as a residential use in our resort residential, resort business district, the Big Mountain. We still have all those zoning districts, of course, in our categories. So for over 35 years, we've considered a short-term rental as a residential type of use. And yes, we do have a definition of short-term rental, and it's residential, short-term rental. The fact that short-term rentals are specifically defined in the code doesn't mean that they don't fall under the category of various types of lodging accommodations. So again, the WB3, the WB2, just like the WB3, allows hotels, motels, and other hospitality. And then when you look at under hospitality and entertainment, various types of lodging accommodations are one of the permitted types of uses. So the reason that we put the zoning district or definition together was to directly relate it to the permitting part of the short-term rentals, that there is a particular type of process and a permit that's required for a short-term rental, and it doesn't apply to a commercial lodging such as a hotel, motel, or a bed and breakfast. Even, with all that kind of information, the definitions, and kind of how we've considered these over the years, the PUD chapter does permit someone to apply for any use that they can justify, that they can make a case to you folks. So the PUD chapter permits residential. It doesn't prohibit short-term rentals, but even all that, someone could say, this is the type of project I want to have. I'm going to make a case before you, and through the PUD process, because it is a zoning district, it's an overlay, they can make that kind of request, and you could certainly ask for that. Your second question, do you have the authority to add a condition of approval to not permit short-term rentals? And of course, the council has the authority to add or delete conditions. You have broad discretion when it comes to these types of projects. But you would need to consider why this is necessary. As described previously, the definition of a hotel is a building containing 5 or more individual rooms. Well, this is a 60-unit development project in 10 buildings. Each building has 6 to 10 units, and there wouldn't be much needed to make that comply to a hotel. So each of those buildings could be considered a little mini hotel. In my report, I put a little comparison of what the city would be going through the residential PUD versus a hotel, including, it'd be quite a bit less parking. The possibility of long-term housing wouldn't be there if it was a hotel. The public access to a trail, there'd be no requirement. They stipulated that on the record that they would allow the public. They've also stipulated that they'd provide $30,000 toward an intersection signal at Acres Lane and Highway 93 South, and there'd be no requirement for that. They're providing 30% open space. If they were just building a hotel, there'd be no requirement for that. So certainly you could add a condition of approval to prohibit short-term rentals, but I think you'd have to ask yourself if it's in the best interest of the community. We'd run the risk of the project being modified into a hotel, which is a use by right in the WB2, and then we wouldn't gain some of those PUD public benefits. Just a couple of other items that have been brought up. Again, the amendments to the short-term rental did not change the list of permitted uses in the WB2. That's been brought up several times. Those other multifamily projects that have been brought up out on the Highway 93 South, you folks didn't condition them to prohibit short-term rentals. The project now called Alta Views, once called The Views, it's had various names. The applicant stipulated on the record back in 2005 that they wouldn't do any short-term rentals. They knew that that was a permitted use with their project, but they stipulated, because at the time that council was pretty concerned about that. So they added that to themselves as a condition. It wasn't something that you folks added. The other two multifamily projects, Whitefish Crossing and Riverview Meadows, they both got density bonuses, and they always intended their projects to be long-term rental projects. So they didn't ask for anything extra. They didn't ask for short-term rental. Their project never intended to be short-term rentals. So this would be the first projects that actually have said, this is what we're intending to do, or have the possibility of this being, Then also under the housing requirement, again, they didn't ask for any density bonuses for their projects, so they're not obligated to provide any affordable housing. Well, we have our strategic housing plan and our needs assessment. We don't have any regulations in place. This is what we're working on right now. So there's no requirement that they provide any affordable housing. There's no mandate. And then finally, there's nowhere in the code where there's a criteria to look at the economic viability of a project. That's up to them to do. So that's all I have, and then I don't know if you want to hear from Angie too.
Katie.
Real quickly, I kind of saw a few looks in the audience while you were going over the short-term rental standards. Can you just finish the paragraph which discusses how it was not removed from WB2, just for clarification for the public, please? Just kind of that whole paragraph.
So
Under amendments to the short-term rental standards.
So the last paragraph on page 2, is that one?
Yeah, it would be, so it would be amendments to the short-term rental standards and not change the list of permitted uses to the WB2 zoning districts.
I'm sorry, I don't know where you're at.
It's the second paragraph. It's the first one under other topics within the second page. Third page of your memo.
Oh, yeah.
Fourth page of your memo.
Oh,
Sorry.
okay, on the back.
Excuse me.
So we have talked about changing, so we didn't change the permitted uses in the WB2. We just took the WB2 out of the short-term rental standards, which is the permitting requirements. You have to submit this application, you need all the different things that you need. But we have talked about changing that in the WB2, but we haven't done that yet. And that's kind of part of the affordable housing. We're gonna add some provisions for allowing residential in that district, but we wanna make sure that they're not short-term rentals, if they're gonna be considered affordable housing. But we haven't changed those list of uses in the WB2 yet. So in order to disallow short-term rentals in the WB2, we kind of have to modify those different permitted uses. So.
Thank you.
Further questions for Wendy or Angela for that matter? Or Dave? Thanks, Wendy. We'll call you back up if any questions should arrive. Frank.
Mr. Mayor, I would like to propose an additional condition of approval for this ordinance. And I did,
if I may, I don't mean to interrupt, but
No.
let's get a motion down on the floor first, and then we can consider amendments or
Okay.
additional conditions, if that's okay.
All right, I would move to approve ordinance number 1816.
Is there a second to the motion?
I'll second.
And that was seconded by Councilor Williams. Frank.
I would also move to add an additional condition that would require that should and if on short-term rentals be allowed or be conducted on in this project, that all such short-term rentals shall be run through a single point of contact or management, and that that management be located on-site of the facility, which I think is consistent with the representations been made by the developer and the proponent of this. And I just want to make sure that since that's important, I think, for any short-term rental.
Let's get a second for the, if you don't mind. That would be condition number 14. Is there a second to the condition, friendly amendment for added condition 14? Seconded by Councilor Fury. Frank.
Anyway, I sense, so that's, I appreciate that it is a representation and a commitment on behalf of the developer that that's what they intend to do. I think that it's important that that be something more than that as part of the conditions of approval, and so that's why I moved to add that as a condition.
Further comments or discussion on the friendly amendment to add condition number 14? We'll vote on the condition, additional condition prior to the original motion. All those in favor, please raise your hand. Those opposed, like sign, and that carries unanimously, I assume, since Frank made the friendly amendment. Further discussion on the original motion? Angela, do you have any concern with the friendly amendment for condition number 14?
I don't know that I have a concern about it, but given the fact that our new, well, I guess they're not new, they've been in effect for a while, short-term rental standards require an on-site contact, or not an on-site, but a local contact for short-term rentals. I I get where Frank's coming from. I don't know that it's entirely necessary, but from what and again, I haven't certainly spoken with the developer or anything, but that was my impression that what they were going to do anyway. But again, I don't know that it's completely necessary given the fact that we have that requirement for short-term rentals, and I think we're doing a lot better job tracking and enforcing our short-term rental regulations with our new software. So, but I guess I don't have a huge concern with it.
Okay. Thanks, Angie. Back to the original motion. Any additional comments? All those in favor, please raise your hand. Those opposed, like sign, and that motion carries unanimously. Michelle. I think we're going to go ahead and let some folks trickle out, and then we'll move on to item 9A. Thanks. We'll move on to item 9A, which will be ordinance number 18-20, an ordinance of the City Council of the City of Whitefish, amending Title II, Chapter 14, Whitefish Community Library Board of Trustees of the Whitefish City Code, and this will be on a first reading.
And could you close that door for us, please? Thanks. There's just a lot of noise coming in from the hall.
Angie.
Thanks. Good evening, Mayor and council members. So my staff report begins on page 44 of the packet, and it's really not much of a staff report because Annie did my work for me. So thank you, Annie, for making my life much easier. So years ago, the composition of the Whitefish Community Library Board of Trustees was actually recommended by an ad hoc committee. And it is 4 members that are within city limits, and then 1 member that must reside outside of the city limits, but within School District 44. And there's 2 primary reasons the ad hoc committee recommended that the 5th position be a member of the county. And one was some potential changes in state statutes regarding library districting. The second one is the community library was new, and they really wanted to reaffirm their commitment to serving patrons in both the county and the city. So years later, the Whitefish Community Library has done an amazing job of establishing its ongoing commitment to serving residents both in and outside city limits. And they serve longer term limits. They've served like 5-year term limits. And so it's sometimes kind of hard to get somebody to fill those requirements. So Annie had approached me and just basically wanted to make that 5th position a requirement that they live within School District 44. It would increase the pool of applicants, hopefully, and they have this trustee and training program that they're looking at, and would make that easier. So the proposed ordinance just strikes out a few words, and it would make the trustee just have to be within School District 44, not necessarily have to be a county resident. They could be a city resident as well. So there are no financial requirements or impacts, and hopefully it will give Annie a bigger pool of applicants for her board. So staff respectfully requests the city council approve the ordinance.
Thanks, Angie. Questions for Angie or a motion? Ryan.
I'll move to approve an ordinance of the City Council of the City of Whitefish, Montana, amending Title II, Chapter 14, Whitefish Community Library Board of Trustees of the Whitefish City Code on a first reading.
Is there a second to the motion?
I'll second ordinance 18-20.
Seconded by Councilor Williams. Further discussion on the motion? Thanks, Annie, for your help with this. All those in favor, please raise your hand. And those opposed, like sign, and that's unanimous. Michelle, and we'll stay with Angie and move on to item 9B, which will be ordinance 18-21, an ordinance of the City of Whitefish, Montana, amending Title V, Chapter 3, Animal Control of the Whitefish City Code on a first reading.
My report starts on page 495 of the packet, and I feel like all I do is talk to you guys about dogs. It's really not an obsession with mine. It was just part of the code that's really needed to be redone. So I think, as maybe Rebecca alluded to earlier, the city's animal enforcement ordinances places responsibility on an animal control officer. We haven't employed one for years, and our code actually makes it mandatory that Adam 8.1. So, and I don't think Adam has done that, at least he hasn't told me he did. So we also, and I don't know the history of it, Michelle probably knows a little bit more, have done dog licensing for dogs within city limits for several years. And the Flathead County Animal Shelter, as far as I know, does it for the rest of the county. In fact, Kalispell used to do their own as well. And they expressed a lot of interest in taking it over for us, which I think made us pretty happy. They have an online system that allows you to register your dog online. You don't have to go down to the city. You don't have to go down to the county. They have a lifelong dog license if you don't feel like renewing every year. And they have an online system where they can basically find dog owners fairly quickly without somebody having to go down and, you know, dig through city records when they have a dog on the loose. And they were pretty excited that we wanted to not do licensing anymore, and I think we're pretty excited not to do licensing anymore. So the proposed ordinance basically removes language mandating that Adam appoint an animal control officer, although it allows him to do it if you guys ever decided you needed to fund that in the budget again. And it provides that city residents who own or possess dogs must obtain a license from Flathead County in accordance with Flathead County Amended Ordinance 3, which is also within your packet. And finally, it requires that dogs within the city limits be vaccinated in accordance with the Flathead County Rabies Control Program. And again, that is included in your packet. So passing the ordinance may have a positive financial impact, albeit small. It'll save some staff time, some staff resources, and I think their system probably better serves the citizens than ours does. So unless you have any questions, I respectfully recommend the council adopt the ordinance.
Thanks, Angie. Any questions for Angie? Richard?
Yes, Angie, as long as we're working on this dog ordinance, I would suggest we review to make sure that the language is gender neutral. There is at least one reference to him. So I mean, it seems to me this is an easy thing, easy fix when this comes back on it's going to come back on a second reading. And secondly, in section 5-3-8, it says that during the first week of each month, the animal control officer and the police department shall present to the city manager a monthly report of the previous month's activities. I would prefer that we language to say a semi-annual or every 6 months have that report, because I don't think Bill Dial is going to give us a report at the beginning of every month on however many dogs were rounded up.
I'm sure so Bill is not dying to do that.
I would suggest we make that adjustment to section 5-3-8.
How would you feel about an annual report?
Chief Dial said he still likes the maybe the daily. I know, just kidding. And it's up to the council, but I don't think we certainly don't need to do it once a month, and maybe twice a year or once a year.
Annual's fine.
Okay, an annual report then to keep us posted on said activities.
Sure, we can make that change, Richard.
So we can review the gender neutrality language and changes to 5-3-8 on the second reading? You're okay with that?
That's fine.
Okay. Further questions for Angie? We do need a motion?
I'll move to approve. Oh, go ahead.
Melissa got it. Melissa?
I'll move to approve ordinance number 1821, an ordinance of the City Council of the City of Whitefish, Montana, amending Title 5, Chapter 3, Animal Control of the Whitefish City Code, first reading.
Thanks, Melissa. Is there a second to the motion?
Subject to the suggested changes?
Okay
Subject to the suggested changes, yes.
Second.
Seconded by Councilor Hiltner. Further discussion on the motion? All those in favor, please raise your hand, and those opposed, like sign, and that's unanimous as well. Michelle, you have Adam's report and close with the packet. Any questions for our city manager? Adam, anything else to report on?
Yeah, I think the only thing to add to this is I think we might have our electric vehicle charging stations put in sooner than expected. So I guess there's only a 2-week lead time on the ordering of those, and I think our electrician is going to be starting tomorrow.
Great.
So could be in within a couple, 3 weeks. So excited to have that.
Great. Thanks, Adam. Richard.
Along with that, I think it's important to note that Climate Smart Glacier Country is paying the electrical bill for the first year at least on those chargers, and thanks to them.
Yes. Thanks, Richard. We'll move on to item 11A. You have enclosed a letter from the Whitefish Community Library Board of Trustees recommending the appointment of Cheryl Highland to the Whitefish Community Library Trustees. This is my appointment, so I will need this to be ratified by the council, but I'll go ahead and move to appoint Cheryl Highland to the Whitefish Community Library Board of Trustees, and I'll just need that ratified by a general showing of hands. And that's unanimous as well, Michelle. And finally, item 11B, you have enclosed in the packet a letter from PWK, or Project Whitefish Kids, requesting up to $50,000 to cover the cost of installing new playground equipment at Smith Fields. I know that we've all had our sidebar discussions with representatives from PWK as well as our own staff. I have in particular with Maria. I spoke with Maria today, and I'll turn it over to Maria to give the council a brief history on this request, the meetings that both the Resort Tax Monitoring Committee as well as the Park Board has had with PWK, and her recommendation on how to proceed with this request, which in my opinion is very consistent with prior procedures and requests of this nature. Maria.
Sure, thank you. So Project Whitefish Kids has been chatting with various organizations or committees. They did come to the Resort Tax Monitoring Committee last month. They've not officially come to the Park Board, but have chatted with some Park Board members. They've also requested the same from staff. We have a lease agreement with Project Whitefish Kids that does state that all improvements will be paid for by Project Whitefish Kids. And that city tax dollars will not be allocated to Smith Fields. And so staff has asked that they ask for an amendment to their lease agreement in order to make that happen. But if you would like recommendations from the boards that would have interest in this, I would recommend that maybe the Park Board to begin with would evaluate the priority list for the capital improvement plan that they have, and any scheduled and unscheduled priorities for capital improvement, making a recommendation then to the Resort Tax Committee, which is what we typically do with our capital improvement plan. Any resort tax funds that Resort Tax Monitoring Committee then evaluates and makes a recommendation to the council if that is the priority level that they would want to see those projects listed as. So that would be my recommendation, that the Park Board review it as part of their priority list, make a recommendation in the CIP, send it to the Resort Tax Monitoring Committee, have them review it as they always do, and then that would come to you as a recommendation.
And Maria, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's my understanding the Park Board is meeting to review their priorities in July?
That's right.
Okay, great. Thanks, Maria. Richard.
How does this request square with the existing lease agreement, or is that something you will bring up with the parks when it goes to Park Board? Or I guess that's the first step.
Can you explain what you mean by how does it square with it?
Yeah, well, the city won't spend, the lease agreement says that the city is not obligated to spend any funds at PWK.
Mm-hmm. Right, so that would be, you would need to amend the lease if you were inclined to do so. So as it stands with the lease as it is, the lease states that you cannot allocate funds. You would have to amend that lease.
Okay, so what we might expect is that the Park Board would come back eventually to council with a request for a lease change? language change? Is that the?
I'm going to
I'm just
ask
wondering about
Angie
the
that,
process.
but I believe that the council manages the lease agreement and that it would ultimately have to go to you. It'd be a recommendation of the park board, but it wouldn't be a decision by the park board
Right.
because you all manage property, public property.
Okay, I just
lease
want to make
agreements.
sure what the steps in the process.
I'm envisioning Park Board would make a recommendation, Resort Tax Committee could make a recommendation, and ultimately, Project Whitefish Kids would have to come to council and ask for a lease amendment. If they want to receive funds, they're gonna, I mean, that lease is extremely unequivocal that the city will not expend funds. And in fact, if our insurance rates go up, they actually have to pay us. So that's how I envision it would go, but they would have to formally come to council and ask to amend a lease if we're leasing property. So.
And if they made that request, it would require the consent of 3 city councilors plus myself and Adam, or 4 city councilors.
To get it on the agenda.
To get it on the agenda item. Any further discussion on this letter? I think the procedure is pretty well laid out and has been described by Maria and Angie. Further comments? Thank you, Maria. We will move on to communications from city councilors, and we'll start with Richard.
Could you start at the other end? I'm trying to organize some thoughts.
Of course.
Please.
We'll start
Please.
with Melissa.
Start with Melissa.
No comments.
Thanks, Melissa. Frank?
No comments this evening.
Thank you, Frank. Katie?
Yes, I have one comment. We received a lovely letter in our city council mailbox from Stumptown Vacation Rentals addressing an owner of a household of which advocating for them to potentially talk about short-term rentals at their residence, and it is not zoned for said business. My question to staff is, can we reach out to this business and kind of educate them as to what can and cannot be done?
Code guides, try to get in touch with them to let them know that, yeah, they shouldn't be trying to solicit business outside of legal areas.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Katie. Ryan?
No comments.
Okay, thanks, Ryan. Frank, or excuse me, Andy?
We're all interchangeable. I'm not quite sure how we do this, but I attended Brian Sullivan's memorial on Saturday, and it was a very well-attended and a very great thing. But, you know, I was thinking about all of the things that Brian did for the city while he was alive here, from the park board to the planning board to the Lakeshore Protection Committee. But I think most importantly, the line that we use and by which we judge all lakeshore applications, the mean high water mark, was established by Brian basically over years of surveying. And he did that free of charge to the city, and because he really believed in it. And I'm not quite sure exactly the best way, but one of the ways I thought of it, if we could somehow refer to that in the code as the Sullivan line or something, or the Brian Sullivan high water mark, I think it would be a fitting tribute to him, and I know for his wife Gail it would be much appreciated. And so, Dave, think about how we might do that in the code, but I think it would be a great tribute to him, because 30 years from now, somebody's gonna go, well, where did we get this from? And just like we started 10 after 7, I think that those people that serve this community for a long, long time and do a lot of good things for it should be recognized. And they should be recognized not just today, but they should be recognized and respected well into the future. So,
Totally agree. You can look into that, Dave? Yep. Great. Thanks, Andy. Richard?
Out of the interview this evening, I'm wondering if maybe we could add, or at least look into adding a building inspection item on the building inspection checklist during the plan review to include review and compliance with architectural review. There seems to be some, I got the impression there was some disconnect between what was approved by architectural review and then perhaps a contractor builder puts something else up, maybe a different kind of siding than architectural review had, but it just gets by because nobody ever goes back and double checks on that. So I think that if we can do that, that would really help us obtain compliance with our architectural review recommendations. Secondly, I would like to see us begin to develop, or if you could bring to us a proposal or two, a suggestion or two on signage recommendations along the river. And since we were talking about animal control ordinances, is there any way, I discover this every time I mow my lawn, since I live right on the bike path and pedestrian path, that enforcement of and encouragement of folks to pick up after their pets is sometimes lacking. Is there any way we can improve on that? Cheap dial.
Richard? Well, I'm just wondering, maybe it could go in the next newsletter. I mean, at least that brings awareness to it and lets people know what the expectations are, that, you know, that they don't, so maybe that's good for the next newsletter.
I think the hard part, Richard, is catching them in the act.
I have a suggestion, a couple of suggestions. Number one, I put something in, I think it was the last newsletter.
Yeah.
Education is paramount. Signage would help. And, you know, if you guys could find money for an animal warden, that would be another thing we could do. We just don't have the resources or, you know, to patrol the bike path to watch for, you know, people not cleaning up after their dogs.
But certainly dogs off leash would, any enforcement along that line might be helpful.
Andy?
If we do put that in the newsletter, I have absolutely the best photo to put in there with it. It's a very large pile laying right at the base of the post of one of the doggy bag dispensers along the BNSF trail. I had to take it because it's like, really?
It's not my goal.
Michelle?
They've already it was put into the last newsletter. There is something in the last newsletter.
Yeah.
But if you would love to send that photo to me, we can put it in next year's, you know, and just kind of as a reminder. That would be great.
You get photo credit.
If you could send we will. We'll give you credit in everything.
That's all I.
Thanks, Richard. Couple things, pretty minor. I just had a question, Dave, regarding once project's approved at the council, and I'll share my ignorance here, it goes through ARC for a commercial building or multifamily, et cetera, not single-family residences. Does an applicant or a builder have to wait for ARC to complete their review and give the stamp of approval before they can submit for a building permit?
Yeah, typically, you have to get architectural approval before we'll issue a building permit. Okay. Definitely.
What I hear
There's
sometimes.
been some times where we've gave the ability to do some site prep work before the architectural review has gone through, but the actual permit for anything has to wait for architectural approval.
So hypothetically, an application's approved here at the council, it goes to ARC, they're meeting once or twice a month. The gentleman that interviewed tonight indicated that in one instance, someone had to come back 4 times before ARC, approved their project. And I understand, and I hold ARC in high regard, and I appreciate the work they do. It's important for our community, but in that example, if they were meeting twice monthly, that's a 2-month approval process through ARC. Now, we've had quorum issues in the past where a meeting skipped. All of a sudden now you're looking at 10 weeks to get through ARC, and then only to have to go through the building permit review process, which from what I'm hearing, I'm not a developer, can take up to 60 days for some more complex commercial projects. So now you're looking at a time frame of up to 4 months after council approval to get ARC and then finally an approved building permit. Now I know it's a totally different type of work that I do in my job, but some permitting agencies require you to prepare and submit a pre-application. So it at least gets the ball in motion with.
And we do that at the ARC. They can come in for a pre-approval where they have some just basic sketches.
For a building permit?
No, well, prior to their building permit, before they do their formal ARC submittal, that they come in with a kind of a pre-approval thing where they show them some basic, just some general things. Because sometimes, there's times where someone will submit just, basically a terrible building plan, and the ARC's like, whoa, you need to change a couple things on this or whatever, and, it's part of the process. But if they come in for a pre-approval, then the Architecture Review Committee gives them a thumbs up, and they can come back with a much more detailed approval with the colors and all the things that they need to get their final approval. But I mean, there's just a lot of times.
But would there be a process that we could consider that would help, put, the building permit at least in motion to when the ARC finally does approve the project, it's halfway to the approval stage so that we can start expediting building permits. So
I mean, one of the problems is, a lot of times the architectural approval is, facades, external things, but they also look at site plan and building layouts and, how it impacts adjacent buildings. And so there's a potential there for the design of the building to change substantially through that process. And, for a commercial building, they have to have a, signed set of plans from an engineer and architect before we can review that for their building permit. And so, it really has to get that architectural approval ahead of time before the formal submittal, because, TAD doesn't want to start approving something and then have the, the Architecture Review Committee be changing things. We need to, that's why that process, and we put signs up all over the front counter saying you must have your architectural review approval prior to submitting a building permit, because people were trying to do that.
Maybe that's the case, and I understand that, but it's just something I want you to perhaps think about. I know with other agencies that I work with, you can do pre-applications and, get your permit at least moving through the system. And all I'm shooting for here is trying to address some concerns that I've heard from developers. I know you've heard, the same comments and criticisms, and it's just in an effort to provide better, client service to the folks and our customers. So I'm not asking for an answer now. I'm just more or less planting the seed. If there would be an option you could bring forward that help expedite, permitting process, I think that would be something I'd at least be interested in looking at.
Okay, Wendy and I can talk to Tad about if there's ways to do that. I mean, sometimes we do issue foundation permits, especially seasonally, like trying to get something in while the weather's good, when knowing that later on they're going to be fleshing out the rest of it. And so we do, certain circumstances do that, but
I don't, give it some thought and just maybe bring it back up at the next meeting or in the next couple of meetings.
Okay.
Thanks. Secondly, Central Avenue between 3rd and 4th looks great. I walked it this weekend. It's going to be a great addition to our downtown and really extend that retail loop as we had predicated in the downtown master plan. So thanks for Public Works for getting that project moving. And then finally, Adam, just real briefly, you provided us a handout that of course we'll review before our upcoming council retreat this week. Can you just in 2 minutes give us a brief overview of what you handed to us this evening? It looks as though you put a lot of thought and effort into this, as did other department directors.
Yeah, so in the past, when we did council goals, it all ended up on one sheet, and there was 4 to 8 words trying to describe a goal. And then there's, well, what's into that? What's the issue we're trying to address? What's the overall vision we're trying to meet? So it kind of opens up a lot of questions. So one of the things I wanted to do here is I wanted to get a goal in place to where there's some background information to it. So on the one hand, what's the ultimate? What do we want to see? What is wrong we're trying to fix? What is the vision? And then what is the goal specifically? And then I want to make sure that there's a timeline that we're shooting for on there. And so then if you look on one of those goal sheets, it's the brightly colored ones on the far left, when you look at some of the guidelines, that is where the city council would provide to city staff any caveats for the goal. So if the goal is, I want a parking plan in the downtown, well, that could mean a whole bunch of different things. This would be a great time for the city council to say, oh, it'd be great if there was a fee in lieu as part of this plan. It would be great if we did this as part of the plan. We want to make sure and do this as part of the plan. So then there's some guidelines that staff can follow when trying to meet the goal. Then if you go into that middle column, that's where staff will kind of let the council know, here's the process that we think that we need to take in going through this in order to meet the goal. And then at the far right, those are the stakeholders involved. We want to make sure that when we're doing plans, when we're trying to accomplish goals, that we want to make sure the proper stakeholders are involved and then how they're going to be involved. So if you look there at each of the goals, you'll be able to see who the stakeholders staff feel need to be involved and how they're going to be involved. Then underneath those 3 columns, there's a section that you know, as we go through this, there's some pitfalls or there's some things that we can kind of foresee as a problem that might come up to either accomplishing the goal or affect the timeline or something like that. Underneath that, you'll see 4 boxes for updates. So this is where I want each quarter. So this is each quarter of the fiscal year. So then you will see October 1st, January 1st, April 1st, an update from staff on those goals. It might be very brief depending on whether the goal is way out there or if the goal is shorter term. Sometimes it might be a seasonal thing, but something will be written there just to kind of let the council know this is kind of what we've done, where we're at, and if we're still on track to meet our timeline. So that's kind of put up there. I organized it by departments. So you have a page in there that kind of delineates when one department starts. Each goal will kind of have a numbering system. So you might see Public Works, and then 19 for fiscal year 19, and then the goal. So then when you see the number there, so if you look at a Public Works, it'll say Public Works 19-01. So that 01 means this is the top priority for Public Works in FY19. So by you guys having those, these are your goals. This just gives staff the opportunity to provide some input on what we're seeing and hearing, what we should be doing over the next fiscal year. They're kind of in a priority that staff feels is would be a correct priority, but feel free to add goals, change goals, update the guidelines, reprioritize if you think one of those is more important than another, because then at the end of the day, these become your goals. And I think essentially what's going to end up in the budget would just be a list, as you see on the front, but then there'll be the other information for the goal that you would see in updates.
Okay. I think this is excellent. I appreciate it. I think it's going to save us a lot of time and keep us on track at our upcoming retreat. I don't have to do a detailed agenda now, so I appreciate that. And I also noticed that Dave updated, the long-term, planning goals, based on the information you presented back in 17. So that's going to be very helpful as well. So we'll take this and run with it, and we'll be prepared to see you that afternoon to have a good discussion.
Yeah.
So.
And also in there, when you get to the planning section, Dave has a new update on all kinds of things too. Because it seems like a lot of the plans revolve around some sort of planning. So Dave's involved in a lot of different goals. So he provided kind of an update on where things are at there too.
Great. Thank you, and thank you to staff as well. Anything further from staff on that note? How about council?
The only thing I wanted to bring up is whenever a counselor says, hey, can you guys do this? I'm always looking around to see if I'm seeing head nods. It'd be good just to make sure that if we're going to assign staff to do whatever work it is, that at least we get at least some nods so that I know the whole council kind of feels like, yeah, we're on the right track.
Were any assignments assigned without nods tonight?
Well, when we're looking at the balloons,
okay.
I'm kind of thinking to myself, because I was involved in one little issue that kind of came up with balloons. Are we looking at lowering cost? Or are we going to have the number or size of balloons be different? Are we looking at making the application simpler? And does the whole council feel like this is a direction that we need to go?
Frank.
To the extent it was my request,
Yep.
My concept here is to make it a little more efficient and a little less costly, certainly for what I'll call minor scope signs, temporary signs. Just, and that's my concept. Tell me where I need to go or whether I need to even be bothered with it. But I think I thought that was a very fair request or complaint that I got, and so I just said that makes some sense.
Yep, we thought that when we got that as well.
I'm
But
not
the
sure
rest of the
Frank gets a
council-
nod from me.
But the rest of the council is good with
Is
that?
the council generally supportive of moving that forward? Head nods?
Yeah.
I'm seeing 5, including Frank and Richard shaking his head, but we'll move that forward.
But
Thank you.
So since we have essentially consensus, we can move that forward. And then the last one is Richard's river sign recommendations.
Support for?
Support
Richard's
for any guidelines that staff can kind of have when thinking along those lines. And if there's general support, Richard can always meet with staff too. And
General support? I'm seeing head nods, and I'll do a better job of kind of corralling
That's-
that during
that's okay.
future meetings as well. 'cause
And then
it's
Richard,
important.
if you have any specific thoughts.
So if he's not approving mine, I won't, don't know what I can do.
So thank you.
Thanks, Adam. Anything further from council? We'll see you on Thursday. We are adjourned. Thanks.
Carpooling, anybody want to?
I have to work afterwards up there. So.